As a biologist, climate change is a major factor in understanding how species adapt and evolve in the particular ecological conditions they are found in. They are important in determining how species are distributed in the world and how species assemblages are formed. And they are important in understanding evolution and evolutionary processes. Climate is a major selective force in evolution. I got more interested about anthropogenic global warming when I saw the movie An Inconvenient Truth in December of 2006. My kids, Patricia and Leandro, reminded me when this happened exactly. What caught my attention was when Al Gore was discussing the relationship between CO2 and temperature. He showed the slides where the ice core data from the Vostok ice cores were presented. And he went up a mechanized ladder, step ladder, to emphasize his point. I noted that there was something wrong in his slide, thus I turned to the literature to check. If, as Al Gore claimed, there is a direct causal relationship between increasing CO2 and increasing temperature, how come the temperature was just fluctuating when CO2 was shooting up? In the course of reading up on the issue, I discovered that when the two graphs are laid on top of each other, it was temperature that leads CO2, rising first before CO2 rises, with a time lag of between 400 to 800 years. It appears that whenever the Earth emerges from ice ages caused by the Milankovitch cycle, the increase in temperature causes the ice to melt, exposing land area, which allows for CO2 to be released, thereby reinforcing the increase in temperature. I'm not a climatologist, nor am I a meteorologist, but I can use the scientific method to make sense out of this issue, to separate the chaff from the grain, and to identify which of the conclusions are based on sound science. Anyone who makes a scientific claim should be subjected to scrutiny, regardless of who pays for his study. Any study which purports itself to be based on science should be scrutinized as well. Just because a celebrity like Al Gore believes global warming to be true and caused by human activities does not make it true. It has to be subject to scrutiny as well. I look at how the data regarding atmospheric global warming and climate change were collected, analyzed, and how conclusions were arrived at. Thus, there are two general observations: increasing temperature and increasing carbon dioxide content in the atmosphere. It is tempting to attribute one to the other. But as a scientific exercise, there are two competing hypotheses to explain these observations about records of increasing temperature in the last 30 years and associated in greenhouse gas emissions. Either this is anthropogenic, caused by human activities, or natural, caused by solar irradiance, cosmic rays, Milankovitch cycle, and others. As I mentioned earlier, the study of climate is complex because of the many variables at various scales that have to be studied, from astronomic to tectonic to atmospheric. And it defies proper scientific protocols. Neither control nor replicates can be set up. It appears that the all analysis and interpretation depend on correlation, or correlations of correlations, even correlations of correlations of correlations. From a human perspective, climate change impacts on health, agriculture, forests, water resources, coastal areas, species, and natural areas, among others. I have discussed the impacts from an evolutionary perspective earlier on, which brings me to my topic for today: anthropogenic global warming beyond the hype. The movie and the report allowed Al Gore and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to share the 2007 Nobel Prize for Peace on October 12, 2007. And they received their award on December 10, 2007. So with those awards, the hype became more intense. And it became difficult, and it's important that we look at this issue with a scientific eye. Unknown to many, the distribution of the movie as an educational material was challenged in a United Kingdom court. The United Kingdom Ministry of Education lost the case, and the movie was declared to be a political tract and not a scientific document. And it was found to have contained 9 errors that were claimed to be based on science. This includes the sea level rise of 20 feet. In the 2007 Ipcc Fourth Assessment Report, the worst case scenario of 4 degrees centigrade rise will lead to a rise of 0.59 meters. This is the high end of the range. The second error was about low-lying inhabited Pacific atolls are now being inundated because of anthropogenic global warming. And Pacific Islanders are now evacuating to New Zealand. No evidence of this has happened. Error number 3 involves the shutting down of the ocean conveyor. According to the Ipcc, it might slow down, but not to be shut down due to anthropogenic global warming. Error number 4, there was direct coincidence between the rise of CO2 in the atmosphere and in temperature. Though there is a connection, it does not establish what Gore asserts. And this was what caught my attention in the first place. The melting of the snows of Mount Kilimanjaro cannot be attributed to anthropogenic global warming. The snows were already melting, and there are other causes to explain this. The drying up of Lake Chad. Again, there is insufficient evidence to establish that this is because of anthropogenic global warming. There are other causes for its drying up. Hurricane Katrina, there is insufficient evidence to establish that this is because of anthropogenic global warming. And this appears to be more due to US government neglect to fix the levees before it broke. Error number 8 is the death of polar bears. Only one study was presented during the court hearing with 4 deaths. The evidence does not support Gore's claim that this is due to anthropogenic global warming. With regards to coral reefs, the Ipcc says that if temperature were to rise by 1 to 2 degrees centigrade, there would be increased coral bleaching and mortality. But that separating the impacts of climate change-related stresses from the other stresses such as overfishing and pollution is difficult. As Thomas Henry Huxley, who is also known as Darwin's bulldog, said, to quote, "The great tragedy of science is the slaying of a beautiful hypothesis by an ugly fact," end of quote. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was created in 1988 by the World Meteorological Organization, WMO, and the United Nations Environment Program, UNEP, to address the issue of anthropogenic global warming and climate change. The role of the Ipcc is to assess in a comprehensive, objective, open, and transparent basis the scientific, technical, and socioeconomic information relevant to understanding the scientific basis of risk of human-induced climate change, its potential impacts, and options for adaptation and mitigation. Review by experts and government is an essential part of the Ipcc process. The panel does not conduct new research. I repeat, the panel does not conduct new research, nor does it monitor climate-related data, or do they recommend policies. That is their mandates. It is open to all members of WMO and UNEP. The definition of climate change by the Ipcc is different from that of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC. The Ipcc's definition is statistics-based and broader and includes natural climate variability. But in this case, we are bound to encounter type 1 or type 2 errors, meaning finding a pattern when there is none, that is, we conclude that it is anthropogenic, but it is not, or missing a pattern when there is one, we conclude that it is not anthropogenic, but it is. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, on the other hand, defines climate change as the change of climate which is attributed directly or indirectly to human activity that alters the composition of the global atmosphere and which, in addition to natural climate variability, observed over comparable time periods. For the UNFCCC, there is no equivocation about the cause of global warming. It's caused by human activities. In the UNFCCC definition, anthropogenic global warming is a fact, not a hypothesis. Which brings me to the 2007 Ipcc report itself. My first question is this. Is this report a scientific one, as they claim? To answer this, let's look at the way reports are made, accepted, and approved. There are 3 working groups involved in the assessment process. Working Group 1 works on the physical basis of climate change. Working Group 2 works on the impacts of adaptations, while Working Group 3 works on mitigation measures. Please note that the Working Group 2 and Working Group 3 assume that climate change is due to anthropogenic global warming. Each working group issues at least 3 types of reports every assessment. One is a summary for policymakers, another one is a technical summary, and then there is the full report. By the way, the full report are on the floors of this platform. Since the summary for policymakers and the technical summary are the ones that are usually read, this is the first document that I focus my review on. This is one of the main findings of the Working Group 1 report. The levels of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane, as recorded in the Bostock ice cores, are all shooting up beyond the charts. Yet, again, if you note, the temperature remained fluctuating, which raises the question about the relationship. Does it really exist? The previous graph, combined with these graphs, are the main basis for the 2007 Ipcc conclusion that human activities are responsible for the observed warming and increase in sea level rise. One thing good about the 2007 report is an elaboration and quantification of the different sources of greenhouse gases, and the source activities are identified as well. There is now recognition that CO2 emissions are not solely from one source. My question about this slide is this: is there no other alternative explanation? This graph, as I've said earlier, can be interpreted to be that of one emerging from a cold room into a hot sun in 100 years. The next slide is a slide apportioning the contribution of different variables that contributes to increase in temperature. It is entirely focused on anthropogenic causes, 7 out of the 8 variables, if you note. What this graph is saying is that we have very little knowledge about how the 6 out of the 8 variables contribute to increase in temperature. That's the one in the last column. The label there, LOSU, means level of scientific understanding. Then take note of the huge error bar for the cloud albedo effect of aerosols. It means that there's a possibility that if more information becomes available, there's a potential for this to cancel out the supposed warming effect of carbon dioxide. If this happens, how can we now explain the observed increase in temperature? In the same report, these graphs are included